Welcome to SciPol SoundBites, the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In these special podcast episodes celebrating JSPG's 10th anniversary, we'll speak with former JSPG staff, executives, authors, editors, and more about how JSPG started and where it's come from, how it's evolved and where it's going, and what opportunities it provides for the next generation of early career science policy innovators. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of this very special SciPol SoundBites podcast season, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, or JSPG for short. My name is Aaron Conrado, JSPG's podcast director and producer, and your host, as always. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you new to JSPG, JSPG is an international open access peer-reviewed publication dedicated to elevating students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career scholars in science, technology, and innovation policy and governance debate worldwide. So for our first episode in this anniversary series, I'd like to take some time to sit down with JSPG's current CEO and her predecessor, talk about how JSPG started, where it's come from, where it's going, and what opportunities they feel like it could provide for the next generation of science policy advocates. So first, I'd like to welcome JSPG's current CEO and managing publisher, Adriana Bankston. By day, Adriana is a principal legislative analysis at the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations in Washington, D.C. Adriana joined JSPG as Director of Communications and Outreach in 2018, and she then transitioned to serving as JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer in 2020. In this role, she elevated the visibility and impact of the journal both nationally and internationally, as well as established and nurtured several high-profile partnerships. Adriana also served as the creator and founding host of JSPG's SciPol SoundBites podcast, this very podcast. Through Adriana's outreach and CEO work, JSPG has seen an increased engagement level, higher quality submissions, and meaningful outcomes for authors in science policy. So Adriana, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Adriana followed in the footsteps of Shalin Jyotishi, who is the second CEO and is currently a senior advisor for JSPG. By day, Shalin works in Washington, D.C. as a senior analyst on education and labor at New America and is a fellow at the World Economic Forum, as well as a visiting scholar in science and technology policy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Prior to his role as JSPG senior advisor, Shalin had been with the organization since 2013 and CEO from 2017 to 2021. During his 8-year tenure with JSPG and 4-year tenure as CEO, Shalin prioritized new strategic partnerships and expanded outreach, communication, and editorial capacity to ensure that the early career researchers published in JSPG have a voice in global policymaking. Shalin, welcome to you as well. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah, great to have you both on. And without any further ado, we'll get started kind of talking about a little bit more about how the both of you got involved with JSPG. What was kind of your inroads to get involved with the journal? And we'll go ahead and start with you, Adriana.
Yeah, thank you. So as you said, I got involved in the fall of 2018, October, I think. I was living in California at the time, working for a nonprofit and looking for ways to engage in policy and to eventually move to DC. I was relatively new to policy at the time and haven't really done a lot at the federal level. And then subsequently moved to DC, December 2018, I think, toward the end of the year. As you said, I was the Director of Communications and Outreach until December 2019, so for about a year. In 2020, got promoted to Chief Outreach Officer, which I really liked, and did that until the CEO role, and started that in May of last year. So it's been about a year or so. My involvement with JSPG, I think as I sort of described, has been really instrumental for my own development in policy, and feeds really well also to my passion of empowering early career researchers in the field. And since we're doing this together with Shalin, I do want to say that I'm grateful to Shalin for the opportunity. It was quite intimidating to step into his role. Was very impressed with what he had done before, and Max, of course. So it's really an honor to be in this position. And as I've evolved and grown in this role, I've seen that it really, I think, fits me well in my personality as someone who is, innovative and creative. If you give me a blank canvas to create something, that's kind of what gets me going. And JSPG has been that, and it's been really a good experience. So thanks to Shalin for encouraging me to apply to the role and interview and really challenge myself to grow in the role, because it's been a great role for me as sort of professional development, but also it's a good example for those who will be watching this later, as someone who's sort of encouraging other people to step into something that they don't think they can do, or saying, try this, say yes to something that you think is a little challenging, which is a good thing in the end. So I owe a lot to Shalin for being here, and have learned a lot in the role, as we'll talk about later.
Well, great. I'm glad to hear that you embraced, this new challenge, unsure of where it would take you. And I think you've had one great year down and hopefully many more to come. So I'd like to jump over to Shalin next and get a feel for how did you first get involved with JSPG?
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. And I have to say, Adriana, it's been my pleasure to work with you. And I just can't imagine the journal if you hadn't come on board and now serving as CEO. So thank you for the kind words, and right back at you. My original touch point with JSPG began when I was actually first really starting to understand the science and tech policy space. When I first joined the journal, Max Bronstein, my predecessor as CEO, was running the organization, and at that time there really wasn't the vibrant ecosystem of support structures to enable the transition of scientists and engineers to policy, let alone folks who didn't come from the academic background into science policy. There really wasn't this national network of student science policy organizations. There weren't many number of fellowships, certainly at the state level. It was a lot more of a nascent environment back in those days. And there really weren't too many ways to get plugged into science policy as someone who was early career other than to work in it. So I found myself speaking with Max when I was actually a technology and innovation policy intern for the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And I was really just starting to understand the world of science and tech policy. I joined on in a role that was sort of like the precursor role of our outreach position that we have today. And I began working with Max and our other team members on outreach and engagement and communications for the journal. And that was really sort of my origin, which I think was a really great place to start, because one thing that I think lots of peer reviewed publications grapple with is how to drive impact, how to drive readership, visibility, and ultimately outcomes. You publish things, but then what happens after that? So it was a really transformative experience, just like Adriana said. My involvement with JSPG resulted in enormous number of personal sort of growth opportunities and skills, and also mistakes. I mean, you make plenty of mistakes when you're in leadership positions too, no doubt about it. So to have that opportunity, it was really, really fantastic. And really now looking back at, gosh, our 10-year history, I just am amazed at just how many individuals the journal has touched from our editorial board. I now think back on the staff, which kind of makes me feel a little old, and just how many folks have been involved with JSPG. And I really think the organization has had some substantial contributions to the field. I don't think we would be working with 100-year-old organizations if we weren't. We wouldn't be partners with AAAS or the National Academies or the American Academy or all of these international groups like UNESCO and the UN if this organization, if this publication wasn't special and doing something different. So I'll leave it at that.
I think that's really interesting. The common thread between your two experiences that you both were heavily involved in outreach for JSPG before then you stepped into the CEO role. And as you were both talking about it, I was thinking about that. And it makes sense, when you're working in the outreach realm, you're making those connections with external partners, with other people in the community. So when you step into a CEO role, you have these connections established. You're really in a well-served position to use those different connections and relationships you've built to continue to grow the journal sort of in an executive capacity. So that's really interesting to see that y'all both sort of followed that path. So any aspiring future CEOs of JSPG, come join our outreach team. I think we've got a well-worn path for you to make it. Well, Shalin, I want to stick with you real quick in your role now, as a senior advisor to JSPG. I'd like to hear more about like how the evolution of the journal has been in your eyes, especially, looking at it from having both that internal and external sort of view now.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Aaron. I sometimes wonder how Max felt when he was serving as sort of an advisor to me when I took on the CEO role. I think the journal's growth has been fantastic. I look at the partnerships that Adriana and the team have been able to cultivate, and I look at the level of professional development that has been the emphasis over the past year, and I just think that's the right direction to go in. I think the journal has always had this interesting opportunity of serving as a source of knowledge and information and research and scholarship, as well as serving as a professional development catalyst. And there really aren't very many spaces where both of those things happen in unison. Especially in a professional setting. You might have your student newspaper where aspiring journalists report on what's happening around campus, and that's sort of a value. But when I think about JSPG's citations in the media and for policymakers, we're really driving action through professional development. And I think that's been a great thing to just sort of witness as now someone not involved with the day to day. I also really think it's an exciting opportunity to sort of contribute from that distance. For example, Adriana and I managed to cook something up with the Financial Times and the Lancet on digital health partnerships. So, the nice thing about JSPG and our network of quite a few alumni at this point is that there's always opportunities to engage. Lita Benenson, one of our first editors in chief, served on the governing board, and there's a great opportunity as the journal continues to do its great work, and as folks sort of rotate in and out of positions, there's an opportunity to actually create a bit of a feedback loop of resources, of opportunities and insights to drive sort of continuous improvement. And I think Adriana has been excellent at sort of incorporating feedback and really listening to what folks need and matching that with her intuition of what the field is looking for. So that's been great to witness from my side.
Yeah, that's great. And it's good to hear, kind of how this sort of community's been built around it of people, once you're involved, people want to stay involved, stay engaged, do what they can to help continue to grow. And then in turn, I think it's helped to grow a lot of other people's opportunities and careers. So I wanted to ask you as well, as the previous CEO, how has JSPG helped you in your own career trajectory?
I think that's a great question. Without a doubt, the leadership skills that I gained in the CEO role have been just transformative for me. When it comes to a lot of these sort of strategic advisory roles, when it comes to fundraising, when it comes to sort of people management and thinking about coaching and mentorship and resolving conflict and empowering and balancing being supportive without being too sort of controlling. I mean, these are all skills that any professional needs, regardless of occupation, regardless of position, regardless of stage of career. These are all transferable skills. And I think that's another thing that JSPG really sort of bestows. Yes, you learn how to write on policy topics, you develop some connections, you get all of this sort of specialized knowledge and skills, but you also sort of gain broad-based experiences that could be valuable. I would say, Aaron, you actually touched on one of the greatest sort of personal outcomes for me in your comments earlier, which is ultimately relationships. The relationships that you cultivate in roles like this one, in organizations like this one, is what makes JSPG such an incredible professional development catalyst. It's what sets it apart from all the other options out there. Not to say that the other options don't afford great networking opportunities, but the position of the journal and where it sits in the field is just a great opportunity to understand really the who's who in science and technology policy. Back in the day, that used to just mean in the United States. Now we're talking worldwide. And I think that's a really great sort of outcome that served me well in my career and in my personal work. I'm writing a book with one of our board members. So, that's just a one-to-one connection, one of many for me. So, in addition to the transferable skills and the usual things I think you might expect to hear, I really think those relationships that you cultivate through JSPG have been really valuable. And I also think that since Adriana took over, the relationship building and the community building aspect has sort of gotten more systemic and more sort of embedded within the fabric of what the organization does, which I think is great.
Yeah, and I'm sure from your perspective, you can see, kind of how the community was, 5, 8, 10 years ago, and then kind of what it's grown into now, and start to look towards, ways it can continue to grow and continue to kind of build those connections. Because I know in the science policy community, most of us came from doing graduate school, from being involved in academia, from thinking that academia or maybe industry was our future. Then you start to get involved in science policy, and you're like, am I weird for liking this? Like, everyone else seems to want to go this other way and they feel so confident. I don't know, but this seems great. And then as you start to build that network, that community, those connections, you realize, oh no, I'm not crazy. Or if I am, there's a lot of other people who are just as crazy as me, and we can all do work on this together and figure out these problems together. And it really does inspire a sense of confidence, and a sense of community, and this, that you have this network to help you in whatever direction your career or life takes you. Yeah. So kind of thinking about that, being a little bit more forward looking with JSPG, I want to go back over to you, Adriana, and as the current person sitting in the seat of CEO, I'm curious to see what your vision is of what kind of science policy issues you see JSPG highlighting in the future, and where you see JSPG, like how does it fit into sort of this science policy community, the science policy ecosystem that has begun to evolve.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So I think obviously, and I try to remind staff of this whenever we have a group meeting, really reminding everyone about what the core mission is, and to make sure that we bring early career voices to the forefront. I think, as Shalin has also said before, JSPG, I think, has filled the gap, which is still true in terms of both publishing and training the next generation in policy in terms of skills in writing and editing. I think one of my goals as CEO is to really make sure that work that is published is more actionable, and it's not just a PDF online. And so, how do we get it out? We've had a few examples in the past couple of years. Recently, a few of our authors who went to DC and spoke about their publications to policymakers. Last year, we wrote a response to an OSTP RFI related to diversity in science policy, and they really enjoyed that. So I think there's a lot of appetite for thinking through how we get these ideas out there to the folks that they're writing the papers for, and sort of how do they talk about that, but also There is the professional development aspect in terms of getting them to speak about the publications and conferences and so on. One thing, and this is, I think I'll say at this point, a year in, work quite in high demand from what I can tell. There's a lot of requests for special issues, and so I have to, sort of gauge who we want to partner with to make sure that we remain novel and timely and relevant to what's going on. Which is also advice from Shalin, again, from I think when he stepped down and I didn't quite know what that meant, about a year ago, how to actually make that happen. But I understand much more now about the landscape and where we fit in and how to make sure that we are still relevant. One other direction, and this is still developing in terms of becoming more data driven, which we didn't talk about, but you'll see more as we progress through the celebrations. Thinking through, policy areas where we haven't published before, parts of the world we haven't explored yet. So we're going through to see where submissions are coming from in different parts of the world, where we should do outreach, where we haven't been yet. And then again, diversity has been a big focus in terms of trying to reach students who are underrepresented or may have fewer opportunities in policy, maybe they're in middle of the country or other areas. And it's been interesting also, I'll mention the UNESCO partnership here because it's a good example of how we've integrated well into the global conversations. The UNESCO recommendations on open science were approved by over 200 states at the end of last year. And so the special issue with JSPG is one of their projects to implement the recommendation and to involve young people in the topic. And it's been great. And that's sort of why we came onto this. But that's a great example of really making sure that we are in the conversation. This is very timely, just happened, and it's a large sort of global discussion. I think also what Shalin already said about how to strategically think about who we partner with, and this comes to thinking through now to 2023, who will be influential partners to help us achieve some of these goals. Again, Shalin and I talk quite a bit about some of this and what ideas and special issues we might think about. So that's been really helpful. I think from my sort of individual perspective, again, appreciate the opportunity to sort of make my mark as CEO, whereas I think the transition from Shalin to my role, some things are the same, some things are not. It's a great way to kind of add your market imprint on things, and that's both exciting, but also brings a lot of responsibility. And realizing that this is a 2-year position. What do you want to achieve at the end of that? And sort of looking back and what you want your legacy to be. And I just want to speak a little bit to the ecosystem, which I think Shalin could probably add to this, but to kind of reiterate what Shalin already said, that compared to 10 years ago, there's definitely many more organizations who are in policy. And that's something to be aware of, which is both an opportunity and a challenge for us because we're operating in a different landscape in 2022 than we were in 2012, right? Something I think about quite often. But I think on the plus side, I think also I feel like there's been more attention paid to involving youth in policy from a number of groups. Whether it's technology and AI, again, Shalin knows that area, but other organizations I think are also recognizing the importance of youth in policy. So that's kind of where I think that we're in a good position now in terms of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to hear some more from Shalin on that as well, as you kind of alluded to. I think he would have some good perspective to kind of build on that of where you see JSPG sort of fitting into this growing science policy ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Aaron. And, I think one of the reasons why the ecosystem for early career engagement in science and tech issues has grown is because the need has grown. As science and technology issues become more complex and more wide reaching in terms of impact, I think policymakers are becoming more attuned to co-creation of policy solutions as opposed to technocratic solutions with, no offense to my venerable colleagues in the think tank space, but with think tank people. There's lots of great ideas that are grassroots and from communities that aren't in Washington. And I think that's why we have this plethora of entities that have popped up and some ways come with JSPG, in some ways followed JSPG into this field of early career engagement. You know, I think when it looks to when we look to the future for JSPG, I think Adriana hit the nail on the head with being relevant and timely, and selecting topics carefully. If everything is a priority, it's difficult for anything to be a priority. But on the other hand, we sort of have to keep the supply up to match the demand. Um, I think one thing that's been really heartening is what Adriana's mentioned, more alignment between JSPG and the work of existing organizations, and in some cases, very prominent organizations. Our collaboration with the British government on COP26, I think, was a great example of JSPG really leveraging its expertise, its unique niche in our field, to drive conversations at a pretty substantial level. Our work around the UN on the impact of emerging technologies on inequity and sustainable development is another area of opportunity. I think when it comes to technology governance, there's lots of opportunities that JSPG has yet to tap. In science, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, technology can sometimes take a back seat. And I think that just goes for the field more broadly. When people think tech policy, they may think of internet policy and net neutrality and privacy and those hosts of issues, which authors do publish about in JSPG. But just the same, it's about the responsible development and deployment of, as Adriana mentioned, AI, Internet of Things, the whole ecosystem of policy challenges and opportunities surrounding blockchain and cryptocurrency. There are many, many, many terrains where JSPG has yet to surface, and there are early career leaders who have ideas to share. It's just about JSPG, reaching into some of those new terrains outside of our current ecosystem. In other words, I see JSPG being in a unique position to grow what is considered the science and tech policy ecosystem because of the flexibility and the agility of the organization that, mainstays in our space just don't necessarily have. So that's what I think is really exciting, is that as Adriana mentioned, demand is growing for the kind of work that JSPG does. There's a societal need. There's just, I think, going to be a little bit more attention paid to how we inject early career voices into the right conversations in the right moments. And that's always the tricky piece, I think, with any policy agenda.
Yeah, I think as you both mentioned, the wanting to be more strategic nature of it, being more strategic in what we cover, being more strategic on who we partner with. I think part of the, what comes with having been in the field for a decade is, JSPG is sort of transformed from being a voice in the field to being a leader in the field, to being a leader in the community, to be one of the places that can sort of, drive these topics forward, that can strategically choose, here are some things that we think this community needs to be more engaged with, and be the person to sort of inject that into the conversations. So, on that note, I kind of want to go back to Adriana and ask her, as the current CEO, where do you see JSPG going over the next, 10 years, to kind of narrow things down? And, what do you see the value of this journal being for that next generation of leaders in science policy as they come up, as JSPG is sort of, starting to do some setting of the tone, some sort of agenda setting for the community? What do you see the value of the journal being for the next generation of folks who are stepping into this space?
Yeah, good question. So not to give it all away right now, and also some of it is developing as we speak, as we just had our governing board meeting last week, and so some of this is in process. I will say that we did talk quite a lot about tech policy actually, so I think we're aligned there, which is probably why I'm in this role. To an extent, I think it's good to align the past and current leader. But I think my sort of goal, or I sort of alluded to some of this already, but what I um, try to cultivate is really more of a sense of community internally and externally. So I think, and again, I've mentioned this to staff before, that I'm not here to do small things. So if people are, that's what you all have to deal with. um, we're not doing the easy path here, but have tried to cultivate some sort of internal community with staff and group meetings, editorial meetings, and so on. As I mentioned already, the data piece I think will be a big driver in terms of how our future directions will be in terms of outreach, as well as the anniversary. Kind of what do we really want to highlight from these 10 years? Really, I think, and I gave this presentation, I think at 100 days or so when we had that other interview, that JSPG should really be the place where early career researchers come to publish, which again, there are other outlets now, and so keeping that still in as relevant. But I think publications help also their careers and what they apply to fellowships and other things. We are looking at, again, this will be a longer term project, but looking at how JSPG has really helped authors and editors progress in their careers, this sort of long-term data analysis. But also, as we've already talked about, how do we think about creating opportunities for them to leverage their ideas more broadly, right? So thinking through media engagement, which we're trying to push for and would love to do more of that. As well as engaging with policymakers and the audience that they write for. And it's been interesting to see, there's a lot of publications on sort of legislative changes and specific legislator that, students write to legislator X about what they would like to see changed in legislation, which dovetails well with my job as well. So that's an interesting intersection to see sort of students be really timely about what they think needs to change in policy today. And the sort of the two areas, right? So we've already touched on this, sort of the educational aspect, the academic side of being an author and editor and going through the process of working on an article itself is valuable, and still want to maintain that sort of skill development. Being an ambassador, which is something new. So this is something we're starting in July that we sort of piloted in 2021, but will be another opportunity for early career researchers to engage with the journal and help promote published work in a different role. And then also, again, the other value is, and still, this is a work in progress in terms of thinking more through what platforms we can provide for them to speak, right, where they can really make this work relevant. And the podcast itself being a platform that I started while I was in the outreach role, and again, hoping to use this to really get their voices out there more.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, when you think of a journal, right, the primary function of a journal theoretically is for people to publish. And so JSPG obviously has very well kind of filled out that niche and that role and provided, kind of a unique publishing opportunity for scientists to be able to sort of, publish in a different way, hone skills in a different way. But what you touched on, I thought was really valuable of, taking it beyond just a publication. Like JSPG sits at this sort of, crossroads of science and society, where what's published in JSPG isn't there to just be like, oh, hey, look at what we found, look at we analyzed, it's there to say, hey, we did that, and now we think you should be doing this. We have actionable solutions. And if, you're just putting it out there and saying, hey, look at it, that's good. But I think if you can take that next step and take it to the people who are making these decisions and go advocate for it and say, I'm the person that researched this and wrote this, and this is what I found, and my best recommendation for you is that you can be doing this. I think that's a really unique and crucial sort of next step that the journal can take. So I think it's great that you highlighted that. And I would toss it over to you now, Shalin, to see if you had anything to add or anything you wanted to amplify from Adriana's remarks.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Aaron. I would say two things. The first is, while I definitely think JSPG is the leader in a lot of cases, sometimes a follower in other cases, the one role that I think the journal has a really exciting opportunity in this moment is the role of a partner, fundamentally. Um, and especially when we think about relevance and timeliness, what Adriana was mentioning, thinking about how we can help others achieve the goals that they have and achieve our goals while we're at it. I think that's how we can foster more win-wins. One thing that's been really interesting to me is I think you're right. I mean, fundamentally, JSPG is a peer-reviewed publication, and it's funny. A colleague of mine on Twitter made a post saying that, I'm a professor, but I haven't published a journal article in 2 years. I feel kind of bad about that. He'd been publishing in different media outlets and doing different things like that, but not in academic outlets. And I think ultimately JSPG evaluating its impact in terms of outcomes and not just outputs is a healthy evolution to have as an organization and as a publication. And I think that's what, Adriana was alluding to. There are lots of publications out there experimenting with being on TikTok and doing Instagram lives and doing different kinds of very interesting and innovative ways to reach new audiences that should be pursued. They're great. But I think the deliberate approach that JSPG is taking in trying to position authors who have credible, well-sourced, well-developed ideas and placing them before their intended audience is a really unique value add and a really exciting opportunity for partnership as well as agency as an organization. So, that's the only thing I just add to Adriana's comment is I actually see I really see it as an evolution of the journal. And frankly, I would say all journals should be thinking in this way too, in many senses, especially the academic outlets that are more oriented towards policy and timely actions. Um, there's a lot of interesting things to be done when thinking about how to give authors space to speak before their intended audiences, or to equip them with the skills they need to do that on their own, maybe even outside of the JSPG framework. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, I love that idea of outcomes, not outputs, right? Not just throwing things out there just for the sake of doing it, but what is the actual tangible outcome of your output, right? Yeah, I think that's an important eye on the prize sort of thing to keep in mind. Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit now to something that I think we've alluded to throughout our interview so far, but talking about engagement with young voices in science policy and the way JSPG can help to sort of amplify and highlight those voices. So I'd like to go back to you, Adriana, and talk about how can early career researchers, if they're hearing this and they like what they're hearing, they want to get involved with JSPG. What are some of the different ways they can get involved?
Yeah, thanks. So, of course, opportunities for publication in both of our standard and special issues, which deadlines are all throughout the year. So this year we'll have 4 special issues. I anticipate that to continue in the future. So hopefully more opportunities for different topics. And then, as we discussed in terms of professional development, we organize webinars and workshops with all of our issues now. to help practice writing skills in policy, as well as hear from policy experts on different topics. So this digital health are a few things upcoming. Open science, again, is quite active right now, and we're having discussions on that. So, and again, also encourage you to watch all the recordings on YouTube. It's valuable policy content there and other topics as well. I'll mention again the editorial board. So, as you know, it's composed of early career researchers, who are looking to build their skills in the field. And we just onboarded a great new class, really fantastic candidates. So, encourage you to look at the website as well, because very proud of the class this year. And then I already mentioned the ambassador program. So this is something new. Again, that's something you'll hear from me probably again, because I like to start new projects and pilot things. So that's one of the things I think I'll leave with the journal here, that I always like to start new projects. But this is one idea to really help, again, early career researchers get involved in promoting published work in communications, outreach events, and also our data analysis, right? So there's different folks interested in different areas within this, and so we really are looking to grow this into a full-fledged program that hopefully will continue from here on. It's a small pilot this year, but already we've gotten a lot of interest from trainees who want to help sort of promote, and they want to learn communications and all these things. So one of the other values which has come up in the interviews from candidates is actually interacting with staff who are policy professionals. And so that's interesting to hear that, you know, they want to work with us and learn from us, be mentored by folks who are in the field now. And, you know, as students up and coming, a lot of them I think will be undergrads, and we're providing that opportunity for them too, but also they want to work with us on staff. So that was nice to see. We're continuing our certificate program in science policy and advocacy with GPS STEM. You see Irvine, which has gone well. It's now the third year. And again, very basic concepts. This goes back to sort of the educational value of teaching skills in policy, as well as interacting with professionals in the field. So hopefully we'll be able to offer that again this year. And then I'll sort of end with this, opportunities for published authors. Again, we'll continue the sort of highlighting and providing speaking opportunities, which hopefully will happen also with our STEM education and workforce issue, the open science, digital health. Some of our partners have ideas at conferences where they're sort of thinking through that, but always looking for opportunities to have them present. And again, media outreach is a large discussion, sort of how to really strategize on that, but would love to see more op-eds from authors and highlights of our work, as we've seen a little bit from universities, but working on that aspect. And then again, the podcasts, bring it back to this, because I really hope that will grow as this medium, especially we expand to other platforms. Thanks to Aaron's work, to really be able to do this on multiple platforms than we've done in the past, to provide more opportunities for authors to speak.
Yeah, and to touch on a couple of those points, if you come and join the ambassador program, you can work on the podcast with me and learn how to write, plan, conduct interviews, edit, publish, get your science communication skills up, and be a podcast editor yourself in no time. So, shameless plug. Shalin, did you have anything else that came to mind when you were hearing those different ways? Anything we might have overlooked about ways folks can, get involved with JSPG?
No, I think that covers it. As far as the early career, maybe I could share some ideas for some of the potential partners in the audience who may not be in the early career category, but are interested in engaging the journal somehow. I think when it comes to doing all things, there's always an exciting opportunity to fundraise, as is probably the bane of any leader's existence when it comes to organizations. But it's an important one, and I think the more the journal can source out different funding partnerships with foundations and believers in early career voices in science and technology discussions, the stronger of a base of resources and dollars the journal will have to support its various activities. So, as former CEO, senior advisor, whatever title you want to give me, I just encourage the foundations and the philanthropy sector out there to consider JSPG and organizations like JSPG that are in this business of early power and early career empowerment and science and technology, because it's an area that seems very niche and very sort of technocratic, but it's really important, and it's an exciting opportunity to build a better future in lots of different fields and industries and sectors and disciplines and areas of work. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for fundraising. Beyond fundraising, I think there's the typical avenues that partners can support the journal, just sharing opportunities with early career researchers, sharing published work with early career researchers. I think JSPG has an incredible social media presence, thanks to you all and your hard work. There's always more promotion to be done of some of these early career voices who are really taking the time and sharing some creative, thoughtful solutions to some pretty important policy issues. So that's just my hope and my request to all of the potential partners out there in the audience.
Yeah, I definitely want to amplify your last point too, because that was what kind of came to mind as you were speaking. As while there may be people listening that aren't themselves early career scientists or researchers, but if they're involved with them anyway, even if it's in a mentorship role, even if it's just like an informal relationship, like, oh, I have a niece that's an early career researcher, I think if you can introduce them to these resources and get them connected into the community, I think the sooner the better, really. I know that, I have not been involved in the science policy community as long as y'all have, but as soon as I was able to get plugged in and start meeting people and learning more about the resources that were out there and the opportunities that were out there, like the path became much clearer of how to, forge a career in science policy, forge a future in science policy. I feel like it can be very murky and very kind of nebulous when you aren't as in tune with it. So I think the sooner people who are interested can get, connected, the better for everyone, really, for us and for them. So I would just encourage, yes, anyone who knows early career researchers that want to get involved, connect them with JSPG and as soon as you can, or if you want to support them, then support JSPG. I think is another good way to go about it. Yeah. So I think we've talked about some of the ways that folks can get involved with JSPG. I'd be curious to hear from both of your perspectives what you've seen over your time with JSPG. What are the impacts then that you've seen from that involvement? Well, what are the impacts you've seen on science policy from the ways people have been involved with JSPG?
Yeah, so I think that depends on how you define impact, which is quite something I think about a lot. And I anticipate this probably will be a lot of probably what my second year will be on, about how to really leverage what we have right now. Um, I think, I would encourage trainees to talk to their legislators. And again, we've done a pilot of this, piloting something else, which I think we'll be doing more of because it's gone well. They've enjoyed it. Legislators were receptive and really thinking, how do we leverage that more? How do we reach legislators who, students reach out to them and give some time to meet with them. And Shalin, I think this might be our next conversation. Potentially. I think the media again.
We won't record that one. You can do it off the podcast.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's okay. Yeah, the media, I think, again, we've talked about this before, but how do we really reach outlets that can highlight what we publish? We can encourage authors to do this, and we're working on developing sort of guides and pitching guides for authors, that sort of thing, but also for us to make connections with them. I think, there's room here for more discussions on how young people can do this. themselves. And we've now created this policy and action page, which you may have seen. Again, trying to highlight what's been done already, where authors have spoken, where they've connected with legislators, and hopefully this will grow. It's really the beginning of hopefully more of these opportunities. I think, as I've already mentioned, sort of the low-hanging fruit is, conferences, and again, our partners can help with this, where they can speak about what they're doing. Our past events, really, we've had authors sort of, speak about not just the publication, but their publication experience. And they're sort of quote unquote ambassadors, or maybe I should use some other word here, but they really are promoting themselves and us just by talking about what they published. And so I'm sort of letting that, flesh out in terms of, okay, talk about what you've published, how's your experience publishing with JSPG. We have a number of authors who have spoken on this and really how valuable it's been for them. I think our editors can do it as well. And with this new cohort, I've encouraged them to list their affiliation with JSPG on their LinkedIn, Twitter, so this is visible. And again, we've had a few universities highlight a new class as well. And so that's really nice to see also that this is being recognized by universities and other groups, that, their students are involved with the journal and all of that. So still, I think the question of, this is more, I think, providing more visibility. And so the question is how this translates into impact, I think, is still a work in progress, but we're working on that. So maybe Shalin has other ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think Adriana hit a lot of them. I think there are these sort of tactical level forms of impact, like citations in the media, speaking opportunities, recognition, accolades, awards. And then there's these sort of qualitative measures of impact that are a little bit more challenging to evaluate. And this goes, I think, just for really any field. Think tanks grapple with this all the time. How do you really know if a think tank has helped drive the conversation? Well, whatever consultant figured that out has a big salary waiting for him. Let me just put it that way. I think one form of impact that JSPG has really had is on this professional development aspect. I mean, we've emphasized that a lot over the course of the conversation. And as somebody who studies labor markets and workforce development, I think it's great when JSPG is able to connect involvement with the journal to some career outcomes, an increase in pay, obtaining a fellowship, an internship, obtaining a job. For me, one of my most sort of proud moments is when somebody includes JSPG in their professional biography, even 5-10 years after they'd been involved with the journal. That to me signals that that person really valued the experience and believes that others in their professional network value that experience. And, we've seen that. The other thing in terms of impact is also around the content that JSPG generates, especially around panels and webinars and talks to inform call for papers. The event series that we had around the Endless Frontier reimagining with AAAS brought together some of the most prominent thought leaders in science policy around. And I know that a lot of non-early career professionals found value in those sessions and attended those sessions. And they got just as much value out of it because they got to hear, true leaders in the field really take unique aspects of analysis on some of these policy issues that they normally wouldn't hear from in your traditional sort of establishment venues for science policy discussions. So, I also think that, JSPG's programming in science policy in of itself can create value. And I think in order to maximize that, it just goes back to what we had been talking about all along is sort of saliency, relevance, timeliness, making sure that we're elevating voices at the right moment, at the right time, on the right topics. That is also of value to other professionals in the field, whether it's the government relations audience that Adriana engages, whether it's my world of think tank and policy, whether it's folks on the Hill, folks in states, companies, thinking about that saliency is also a way of having really broader impacts, even beyond our core audience of early career researchers.
Yeah, that's great. I think just having this conversation, has almost sparked more ideas, different ways, things we can do, ways we can have an impact. I feel like this is something that an external audience will consume and hopefully get excited about, but that we ourselves can go back and review and be like, oh yeah, we can think about that. Yeah. So this has been a really interesting discussion. I want to start to, bring it home. So going back to, the journal aspect of JSPG, the publication aspect, I'd be curious to hear both of your perspectives of, how can early career scholars advance their careers by publishing in JSPG? What do you think the impact on their careers of that publication in the journal is?
Yeah, I think it's very useful. As we've seen a number of folks who have, applied for internships and fellowships, it's valuable to have a publication in policy as an early career researcher to point to that when you're applying for AAAS, right, or something like that, to where this shows that you have some expertise, you've engaged in writing, and just the reputation that JSPG now has for their own careers, right? That means something that's published in a peer-reviewed journal. Again, it is unique in that sense that it's early career and the value that brings to their careers. I think definitely as authors and also for editors, being able to shape the journal's direction. We've had now orientations with the new cohort, and that's something they really value, being able to bring their ideas into the mix and what they think we should publish, and learning through that process. I think, and I'll bring this back to the community aspect, because I really try to build this as a CEO and really, get the authors to get to know each other. The podcast has facilitated that, which wasn't necessarily direct or on purpose initially, but authors commented that they like meeting other authors, like, oh, I'll read your paper now because now I met you in person, and so on. So that's been interesting, and I think we should continue these kind of discussions with author groups. Again, with the editors, they've enjoyed sort of getting to know each other through some events we've done. So last year, I think we organized the first sort of social event, again, for editors to know each other. Did the first orientation, this last week, actually, we had 2 sessions, again, just to sort of talk to them about the journal, get to know each other, meet us, and meet the editorial team and leadership. That's been nice. So again, creating more of this sort of face-to-face that we can do, because that's challenging to try to do that as an online journal, but I think it's appreciated. I would also say, again, then bringing back to the staff, and if you're an early career researcher listening to this, talking to people who are and were involved with JSPG in the past and where they're now, sort of how did they use the experience, to look at, where they've gone in their careers when they were students, when they published. We interviewed authors, I think last year, who published in the first issue, which is really interesting to hear, and where they are now and what kind, they have positions in government and so on. So that's interesting, and again, something to look at and think through. Again, this community feel of what we're creating here, and folks who have gone, been involved with the journal, but now gone on and have, certain positions, and that's a good resource to reach out to them as well.
The only thing I think I can add to what Adriana shared is, thinking specifically about the impact of publications for early career researchers, you can either think about, so I think there's 2 sort of typical avenues. On one hand, you think about what skills and expertise you have and how to impact policy using those skills and expertise. That's a traditional approach, science for policy. That's our usual trope. But then there's this other dimension, which is, maybe I'm an environmental scientist, but I really want to work in AI policy. So JSPG is my vehicle to publish on AI policy, even though I'm not necessarily an AI expert. I may not be able to get published in the top AI policy journals, but I would be able to get published on a science and technology policy topic related to AI, even if I'm not really from that space. So career transitions and career pivots, I think, can also be facilitated through JSPG, in addition to just career advancement. So that's really the only thing I'd add to what Adriana mentioned.
I think that's a really interesting and actually really important point. I was interviewing someone for the podcast the other day who had an article on like wildfire insurance in California and how it needs to be better informed by climate change. And I was like, how did you get interested in this? And she was like, well, I'm a like a applied physicist in grad school, but I took an economics class and they were talking about this and I thought it was interesting. So I started doing my own research, looking into it and talking to people and got passionate about it, wrote a paper about it. And then, legislators have read this paper now are trying to think of ways that they can implement it. And I was like, that's so fascinating, that, her scientific expertise was completely outside of this field, but she was able to, apply the things she learned from being a researcher, those analytical data skills, critical thinking, ways to analyze patterns and then come up with solutions and leverage that towards a different problem set that she was passionate about and get published on it. And now she's like, would be considered an expert in that field, that specific, niche field. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that is a very powerful tool that JSPG can give to early career researchers, that if they have something in the policy world they're passionate about, you don't have to be studying it. That's okay. If it's your passion, then, put your passion on paper and come to us and we'll do our best to see what we can do to help you get it published. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's this is the whole challenge with disciplines, and it's also the value of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work is, you can sort of cross-pollinate expertise and thought patterns and thought processes and methodologies across different issue areas. So now that's great, Aaron. That's a great story, actually. I hadn't heard of that episode. So
it will be out soon.
Stay
okay. tuned. Stay tuned. Watch this space. So I've just got one more question for y'all to kind of wrap things up. Is there any other advice that y'all have for early career researchers who are interested in science policy? Anything that we haven't touched on that comes to mind? And I'll start with you, Shalin.
Gosh, we've really covered a lot over the course of this conversation. A couple of key points I guess I'd leave folks with is in any policy space, relationships are key. The sooner you can start building relationships with people, having informational interviews, learning the skill, because I do think it's a skill of networking and communicating and building contacts, the better off you'll be. Especially if you're transitioning from academia to policy or transitioning from any sector to any sector. And then the second thing I'd say is, having a clear understanding of your own sort of strengths and areas of growth and improvement. I think ultimately my experience from JSPG has taught me that. I now have a better sense of what I do well, and I have a pretty good sense of my areas of growth and improvement. And owning that early in your career is really helpful. I'll give a shameless plug to the Jim Clifton Strengths Finder exercise, which has been really valuable for me in identifying sort of your strengths. And there's different tools. Some are free, some cost money that early career folks in the audience could tap into. So I just emphasize building relationships and then know what you do well. And then also super important, know those areas of growth and improvement or weaknesses, I guess, is another in quotation marks way to frame it. So
all right. So to close, this is advice I always give to early career researchers who reach out to me, ask me, how did you get your job and all this kind of stuff. And, I always say there's a lot of pathways getting into the field. It's really your story and your career. Create your own path, take ownership of it. As Shalin said, reach out to folks who can help. And again, mentors who are here, I think in some ways we've served as sort of peer mentors to each other and to other folks as well. And I'm certainly happy to chat with others who are interested in policy, starting out, looking for opportunities, looking at nonprofits, societies, or professional organizations that, again, I've used along the way and sort of been involved with. And of course, continue to keep an eye out on JSPG and future opportunities to publish, hone your skills in policy, and keep in contact with us and how we can be helpful.
Well, Adriana, Shalin, thank you both so much for all of this amazing discussion today. Lots of thought-provoking responses, lots of very unique perspectives. I think there's a lot for both our audience and for for all of us to sort of chew on. And I think our listeners have definitely learned a lot about the journal and how they can get involved with JSPG. For those of you listening, I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find this and others like it on JSPG's website at sciencepolicyjournal.org, or our channels on YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you listen to all your favorite podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, whatever it may be. Please stay tuned for future episodes in this series and for other activities that we'll have planned over the coming months as we celebrate JSPG's 10-year anniversary. And thank you both again for being here today. That's all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to all your favorites. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal. Thanks for tuning in.